This is Closer by Dennis Cooper. Part 3. George. Thursday, Friday, Saturday. George looked at a poster for Saturday's dance. It was too badly drawn. Were those people's faces or not? He had to tilt his head to get the information. At least it's colorful, he mumbled, wishing he had a few felt tips himself. He'd make one twice as weird. Wonder who drew it? Footsteps. It was Mr. Reed. "I said go straight to the office," he yelled, grabbing George's arm. "Now!" George let himself be dragged off, arms and legs flailing about. He thought of how vulnerable he would appear from a distance, but the halls were deserted. "Yes," sighed a man George assumed was the principal. Mr. Reed pointed at George. "He has been sleeping in class all semester. I can't do a thing with him." George shut his eyes so he wouldn't look bored. That way, he'd feel what these assholes believed he should. George imagined a clock face. It read 3:30 p.m. A bell rang. A school bus pulled up to his feet. Its doors swung open. "So, Miles," the principal said, "do you have a suggestion?" George thought a second. "Transfer me into Mr. Mago's class." He opened his eyes a crack. Reed looked hurt. Tick, 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 tick. "You can go." Taking a couple of books from his locker, he stood on the sidewalk in front of the school. 10 minutes passed. A blue van pulled up. "Where to?" The driver had long, straight black hair and a mustache. There was an old mattress slung in the back, with a collie on top. "Like school?" the driver asked. "When it doesn't get in my way," George said. "I hated it, but it makes sense in retrospect." "Well," George said, "I'll let you know." The driver laughed. He seemed okay, if a little too into the hippie shit. The peace symbol paperweight around his neck was a joke. They talked. George let out some info. Rich parents, Disneyland, grass, acid, only child, gay. They shared a joint. "But I like my dad," George went on. "But I don't have much choice. See, my mother's so sick all the time. That's the turn just ahead." The van pulled next to the curb. The driver put it in park. "Why don't we—" He gestured out at the road. George thought his eyes were a shade too erotic. No, homework." George clutched his books. "Call me," the guy said, handing George a card. It read, "Chuck Roosevelt, Carpentry." Maybe George meant that. George knocked 3 times on his mom's bedroom door, thinking she wouldn't hear. "George?" He went in and eased himself down on the bed. They never spoke much. His words were hard on her. She'd love to talk, but the struggle might polish her off. He watched her face twist and turn like a special effect. When he felt awkward just sitting there, he kissed her shiny gray forehead. Kissing her left him weak. Back in his room, he had to waste a whole joint getting over it. Part of him knew she should die, and leave others alone. But he wanted to kill himself when he realized that. Things were incredibly fucked up. "Dead men tell no tales." George said those words with a fake British accent. He'd heard them spoken that way in his favorite Disneyland ride. Repeating the line 6 or 7 times cheered him up. He told himself he'd experienced death. It half worked. He sat up in bed and thought of calling the carpenter's house. At least he'd be out and about. Sex was distracting, even if who he'd be having it with was a bore. "Hi, Chuck." "Great, George. I'll pick you up around 6. Bring a warm coat." "I'm having dinner out," George told his dad when he heard the familiar knock. Mr. Miles parted the door a crack. George confirmed he'd done his homework. School was fine. He'd opened the window because it felt good, not to cover up anything. "Yeah, I'll be back by 11. "I love you, George." "Likewise, Dad." Chuck drove them into the hills. George knew the spot. Cocaine Flats, as somebody had dubbed it. At the end of the steep, winding road was a parking lot. Great view of twinkling lights, total privacy. Cops could be seen miles off, grass ditched or pants zipped up. No sweat. Chuck led George down a trail littered with beer cans. No one was on the big slab of cement. It stank of piss. Chuck lit a joint. "You're an incredibly beautiful boy," he said. George cracked up. Smoke tooted out of his nose. Chuck leaned over and kissed the tight, hazy grin. George felt a hand swim around in the front of his underpants. He liked the feeling of being plugged up. Sloppy tongue down his throat, fingernail in his piss slit, 2 fingers up his ass. Chuck shook a little and came on his stomach. "Lick it off." George did. Chuck drove. George stared straight ahead. "Please," Chuck whispered, "don't tell your folks or—" George shook his head. "I didn't mean to freak you out." George nodded. He didn't know what he felt, but there were tears in him somewhere. "Let me out," he managed. "I'll walk." George turned to a page in his diary and wrote, "Today I felt sick or tense or something else. Pressure in head and chest. Aren't I ever going to get back to normal, or what I remember of that? But no one seems to give a fuck, so I shouldn't. My friends bore me. I ate lunch with Sally and she pissed me off. Paul was fine for a while, but I got too fed up. That David person keeps trying to get me in bed. I'm considering that. My decent mood has changed into a weird feeling. Intense. I got thrown out of class today. I'll try harder tomorrow. Right. Smoked grass this evening and it ruined my thinking. I realize how screwed up and closed off my feelings and personality are in my dealings with people. Don't have a solution, though. I allowed this guy Chuck to have sex with me. I did it because it was something to do, not because I admired him. I was like something he wanted to buy but couldn't really afford. I know that's stupid. He doesn't even know me or want to. I was afraid to let go, or I felt like this pretty thing with a few rips in it. I wanted him to get rid of me. He did, but he apologized too much. He wasn't strong and that upset me. I'm not sure why, except the obvious. I'd like to get away, meet some new people, stop smoking grass all the time, get closer to my feelings. I cut them off for a while. That felt better at first, then worse. I'm confused, but not worried for some reason. It'll work out, I tell myself. Ring. George Miles, please stay after class a few minutes. The room emptied out. Mr. McGough asked why George had been transferred. I think I'm just too imaginative. I admire that in a youngster, the teacher smiled. But put your skills, shall we say, where they'll benefit both of us. That's all I ask. He patted George's head. Okay, take off. George paused in the doorway, bit his lip. You like movies? He asked. Some of them, naturally. Maybe we could go to see one this weekend or something? Why, you're lonely? Mr. McGough made a pouty face. That's not what I meant, George said. Fuck it, never mind. George saw his former girlfriend at a lunch table. Hey, McGogh's great, she said, mouthful of meatloaf. Yeah, George yawned. He seems okay if a little too into himself. He's a real poet, George. You can't expect guys like that to be generous. She fished around in her notebook. Read this. It was a poem of Mr. McGough's titled Paler, Smaller, Less Touching. It seemed to be about love, but was much, much too wordy. All George could see was a bunch of stuff mixed inexplicably. It's fine. He handed it back to her. Let's smoke a joint. They crawled under the green football bleachers. She kissed his sweaty cheek. He knew she still liked him, even if they hadn't fucked in months. He had made his own feelings perfectly clear just the weekend before. I know, she'd sighed. You like boys, at least for now, right? They passed the joint back and forth, looking out at the football field. George thought its dry, trampled acres looked beautiful. He had a fondness for empty things normally filled up with people. Abandoned houses, parking lot structures on Sunday nights, holograms, telephone booths. You'll be at the dance, I hope? George nodded, lighting another joint. Mr. McGough will be one of the chaperones, she told him. Pleased as he was by this news, it would give them a chance to talk and maybe something else. He made his face look unbearably bored, a favorite pastime of late. "I'm going to make a prediction," she said in a trembling voice. "You and Mr. Mago will be boyfriends by Sunday." "You're just jealous," he said. "No, I think you'd be handsome together." George thought it out. The guy was clever, artistic, sarcastic, and... I don't know, Sally. I'm too stoned to argue about it. George daydreamt his way through the rest of his classes. In Art 1, he put a few drops of black paint on a large sheet of paper and smeared them around with his thumb. That was the day's high point, although it got him an F. He was walking to bus number 12 when he heard a familiar voice. "George, wait a sec." Mr. Mago said he'd give him a ride. It was a black Ford with bucket seats, large enough for a family. "You married?" "Used to be, but I don't think a commitment's the right thing for me." "Hey, I heard you partake," George said, pulling a joint from his pencil case. Mr. Mago pushed the lighter in. While they smoked, Mr. Mago talked a lot about New York, heavenly, rock bands he liked, ones with rough edges, grass he had smoked in New Guinea once, brilliant, how TV rots people's minds to the beauty of language. George watched his face. It was a sun-baked wreck, but sort of young underneath. "Thanks," George said, slamming the door shut. "See you Saturday night." "No doubt," Mr. Mago grinned. He gunned it. As the car sped out of sight, George put a hand to his forehead. He was about to do something inane, like cry. Now what? He lowered onto the driveway. A hand touched his shoulder. "Are you okay down there?" George burst into tears. He struggled up and threw himself at the man's chest. "I love you. Shit," he sobbed. But when he saw the tattoo of a battleship, he tried to free himself. "No problem, honey," his dad whispered. "Let it loose." Why am I such a waste? I don't care about anything. I used to. Really, a lot. I could make people like me and they'd come back here and I'd show them the stuff in my room. It was great. I was thinking of John today. I really liked him, but he only likes art. That David asshole keeps bugging me. I've decided he's nuts. Sally told me he's not a rock singer at all, just a liar. I think she's in love with him. I don't know what's going on. I keep crying for no reason. Now I'm hung up on this teacher. He seems nice, but I'm not sure he is. I know it's because he's a friend of John's. Not that I want to see John again, it's just... Oh, fuck it. I wish I knew what I wanted. I'm still trying all sorts of stuff, and when the right thing shows up, I'll keep doing it. Sometimes I think drugs are better than anything else, but I'd still like to stop doing them. Sure, forget it. I saw this movie on TV tonight that made me think a lot. It was about this boy's death. He was like me. He took drugs and all that. The way he acted when he smoked a joint was a joke, but it wasn't too bad when he started to think death was great. The best part was when he took acid and thought he was dead. He saw these neat-looking skeletons who said, "We're you," and pointed down at their bodies. It scared him, but I would have stayed with them. It looked more fun than his life. Now it's late. I hear Mom's chest all the way through the wall. It sounds like the ocean. I guess I should go to sleep. There's no school tomorrow, thank God. Maybe Mr. Mago will fall in love with me. Sure. That's stupid. I know that. The gym looked spectacular. Colored lights pinpointed certain spots. Dance floor, refreshment stand, makeshift stage, but left the rest unimportant. George looked at it for a while. Then he put the orange acid chip under his tongue. Goodbye, cruel world, he thought. Sweaty hands covered his eyes. Sally? They were withdrawn. Nice guess, Paul smiled. Then they yelled in each other's ears. Music sounds great this loud, Paul bellowed. I feel like I'm inside a tiger's mouth. George would have used the word battleship. He felt like dancing. Seen Sally? No way, Paul shook his head. Got any drugs? He added. George shook his head. Just what I'm already on. Well, I'm on a drug run, so see you, man. Later, George said. He scanned the room. He couldn't see faces, just smeared ovals. She'll find me, he thought. There was Mr. Mago. George recognized his suit. George rose and made his way through, sometimes accidentally bumping into, some people he vaguely knew. If they were greeting him, he couldn't tell. Still, he was pretty sure Mr. Mago licked his lips when their eyes met. "Hey, George," the teacher said. He led them into a quieter part of the gym. "I trust you, don't I?" George nodded. "I've gotten access to the coach's lounge." He pointed a finger at George. At its end, swinging back and forth like a pendulum, was a big ring of keys. "You and I?" George licked his lips. "I get the picture," he smirked. Inside the office, Mr. Mago felt around on a cluttered desk, found a lamp. It lit up Coach Burke's diploma and an old snapshot of him in red swim trunks. Once that fat blob was a knockout, George thought. Yuck. "Prepare yourself for a charming surprise," said a sexy voice. George settled back on the desktop. He felt his ass squish against it. He gripped the trimming. His knuckles turned purple. He shut his eyes. He parted his lips wide enough that a tongue could fit through them. George thought, if God made a visit to Earth, it'd be in the form of a kiss. Being kissed by someone I admire is the closest I've gotten to peace on Earth, like Xmas carolers sing. God would give each boy a taste of his lips, then go back to whatever dimension he hides in. That would help. What a whacked-out idea. George liked how acid could blow up the flimsiest topic. Just then a sharp object scraped through his lips. His eyes flipped open. Mr. Mago put a match to its other end. "Pure Nicaraguan," he said. "Go ahead. Blow your brains out." 2 minutes later they edged through the door. The dance floor was a blur. Its details had blended together, a greenish white. It made George think of a Xmas tree, flocked, lying down on its side. He was afraid he'd get cut if he entered it. "Come meet some people, kid." "Huh? Oh, right. This is Maureen Kendrick, a wonderful talent. And these are some friends of hers. Alex," one muttered. "Cliff," said the other. Their faces were featureless, like outer space helmets. "Now we'll be off," announced Mr. Mago. He pinned George in a headlock. Cliff yelled goodbye like he meant it. The dance petered out. George spent the last hour sitting alone by an unlighted tennis court. He felt too high to make sense, especially to himself. Mr. Mago had gone somewhere with John. "Hell, I hope," George said wistfully. "I hate their guts." He stared up at the moon, tried to read its lips. "You would accept a ride home?" said a voice with a heavy French accent. "I can't talk," George whispered. But slightly curious, he turned his head. It was a stranger of some sort. "Philippe," the guy said, stuck one hand out. His ring had an ivory skull on it. He guided George to a Porsche. George reclined in the back and faked sleep. When the car stopped, he roused himself. It was his house, but the lights were on. He didn't want to be seen at the moment. He checked Philippe's eyes. They were nuts. Perfect. "Take me away from this." Dark leaked through the blinds. George took a sip of his screwdriver. Philippe didn't talk much, nor make any sense when he did. George was too loaded to do more than comment on stuff. He already said he liked everything in the house. He thought, "I'm passing out." "You are mine tonight." George slowly opened his eyes. "Would you like to know how?" George shrugged. "Just do it." He yawned. "No. I need you to know. I watched you bend over an hour ago, and your Levi's were tight to your ass. I saw the crack. It is so wide and deep." George almost laughed. He took a drink instead. "Think how the glass is your crack." George giggled. "Think that you are in the desert. This alcohol is the last you will have for a year." George stuck out his tongue. "Good. Put it into the drink." Great sense of humor, George thought. "You notice those ice in the drink? That is your shit. Take one into your mouth." "Jesus," George muttered, sliding the smallest cube through his lips. "Hold it there. I want your mouth very cold." George glanced up. Sure enough, The guy had actually said that. Yes, good. Now lie on the rug. George set his glass down and sprawled on his back. Relax. Open your mouth. Loose your fists. George heard the floor creak. A shadow fell over his face. One of Philippe's hands encircled his wrist, raised that arm, let it drop. Hands started roaming all over his clothes. First they followed the shape of his skeleton, inching along like it was covered with braille or something. Now they took hold of his crotch, separated his cock from his balls, then the balls from each other. Drôle du ménage, Philippe said. That's a compliment, George guessed. Just then a cock clogged his throat. Skin and pubic hair smothered his face. It made him think of the pirate mask he used to wear every Halloween. He concentrated on that fun idea, and did his best not to think of Philippe, who was patting him down like a cop. The cop yanked his pants off. A hand scooped his balls up. A fingertip poked them around in their sack. They rolled badly, like footballs. George wondered how that looked. He'd never paid much attention to how he was built, thinking that he was for others to like or dislike. The acid chip hadn't worn off after all. George tried to imagine the things on his body. He saw a sparse-looking skinny kid. He played with its crotch like he was a cat and it a rubber mouse. When that got boring, he rolled the kid over. Flop. The fantasy's sharp lines began to blur. He knew he was stroking his own ass, but he couldn't define its appearance. What he did see was too non-specific. He opened it. Why did I do that? He wondered. His thoughts had a very slight echo. He faded out. Where was I? He was an old miner pointing his gas lantern into a cobwebbed shaft. He scratched one dirt-caked, stubbly cheek and pushed his hat back. Far down the passageway, covered with dust, a small skeleton swung, tinkling in a rotted noose. He took his lamp and cut it loose. George blinked, attempting to stop the hallucination. He'd accidentally shit. He tried to rise up. No, Philippe shouted. That is what I wanted to happen. His voice sounded pre-recorded. George tried to do what he always did when life grew too realistic. He made up a Disneyland ride and rode through it. This one was honestly scary. It wended its way through a dark, barren tunnel that kept getting smaller and smaller. Occasionally, skeletons fell from the roof and cracked in slivers around him. A heavily accented voice was saying really weird things like, "You are dead, baby." Ouch! The ride ended. George didn't mind being fucked. That was business as usual. But the aroma of shit was disgusting. As soon as Philippe got his rocks off, George ran to the bathroom and puked for at least a half hour. I never want to have sex again, he moaned. Period. He took a shower. He thought about things. They added up. He started crying. It wasn't easy to stop, but he managed. He made a face at himself in the mirror. Jerk. When he got back to the living room, Philippe was waving around an air freshener. That made him cry again. He struggled into his clothes, stopping every few seconds to wipe his nose, dry his eyes. When he got to the door, Philippe strolled up. You are very beautiful, he said. George shook his head. You fascinate me. George shrugged. He opened the door. It was dawn. The light hurt his eyes a bit.